Good evening, good day. As I have, as I last had the opportunity to gain a sense of the economic reverberations besetting the European continent, it appeared to take on ever always delightful austerity measures, as they like to call it. It seems that the German central bank was prodding the Greeks to accept another round of austerity measures to be painstakingly conscientious they might be when pressed for answers to the solution for the Greek debt crisis. The situation is one that seems to be a rather fluid one to suggest austerity measures, don't you think? Under the circumstances, it would seem far more likely that the German and French central banks might have to recapitalize what could be dozens of institutions throughout the continent in countries like Belgium, Italy, and Spain. But beyond that certainty, anyone can plainly see that the debt crisis emerging in those very same countries would preempt any ability to recapitalize individual institutions outside what presumably would be directed to absorb the debt crisis, first under any conceivable emerging situation. The hard and unfortunate truth to this matter is that whatever measures the central banks and the IMF may finally agree to, it will be by anyone's standards something far worse than the austerity measures. I cannot believe the arrogance of the way the financial leaders are characterizing this, as if not to even bother to tell the Greeks the harsh facts, but nonetheless ask the people to tighten their belts for a while until we can eat up the debt-ridden South Europe. It's a comedy of errors, and the G20 meeting in Paris in early November is asking the IMF and central banks to have a long-range strategy ready to implement when they convene in less than 3 weeks. The absurdity of this is confounding on so many levels. U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner suggested that the European central banks needed to resolve this problem in Greece quickly to contain the spread of the debt crisis from infecting a larger global economy. First of all, I think we can all agree to the fact that that remains to be quite obvious, and I'm certain the central banks of Europe are not intentionally dragging their feet on the solution, but rather expect they might not fully know to what extent this breakdown involves, because they are faced with not just the debt-ridden crisis, but rather the prospect of having to recapitalize weak institutions that are not even from the debt-feared Greece, Italy, and Spain, but rather places like Belgium and France. And now they are asking the IMF to guarantee hundreds of billions of euros to possibly inject into the current meltdown solely for the debt crisis alone. It's not known if the IMF will act on the request, but when the G20 meets in November, we will certainly know, and you can expect the United States, represented by Timothy Geithner from Treasury, will be the first to insist that they accept these loan guarantees. Because the debt crisis in Europe is starting to spill into the larger global, but most specifically the United States economy, because Europe is our largest trading partner, and as such we are extremely affected by the continued loss of confidence in the European markets, and a threat of devaluing European nations, of defaulting European nations, will all but ensure the further weakening of our own capital markets here, as well as eroding confidence in the Obama White House cannot afford to occur, since it seems likely that Treasury will undoubtedly attempt to issue another round of U.S. bonds in an effort to shore up their own debt load that is at least 2 times the size of the entire European continent. It's truly amazing to me as I witness the players from this drama. Geithner from Goldman Sachs, who for all intents and purposes was intimately involved with the 2008 collapse of the capital markets precipitated by the housing bubble. Now as Treasury, Obama together they want to ferment confidence in our markets long enough to support another bond issue so that they can shop even more toxic debt to our own people, because if you didn't know it, the rest of the world's not buying U.S. Treasury bonds any longer. Only the Americans themselves are buying their own debt. They have already shopped the debt all over the world, and now in an effort to try anything, they will buy them. They hope or presume they'll buy them again. Can you see how Machiavellian this whole thing is? Utterly pathetic. Rather than calling him what he is, which is a liar of the first sort, more culpable than Bush, as he is a professor of constitutional law, for Christ's sakes, I need not tell him about how he routinely breaks the Constitution and has the complete inability to utter anything with even a hint of truth connected to it from the very outside of his campaign, telling cheering crowds in the stump that he was going to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as soon as he was elected and close Gitmo in Cuba, none of which has yet to be done. Like Nixon before him, he has escalated the wars and heightened our domestic exposure. I hoped with every fiber of my being that the country will wake up to this charade and the con game being played on our people, leading them into slavery, as Thomas Jefferson stated 250 years ago already, when situations like this arise through the repeated acts of usurping of civil liberties throughout every change of minister over a certain span of time, there can be no other option but to overthrow that government, because it's now expressing despotism and tyranny. Death to tyrants is obedience to God. Governments should take careful attention that the people is beholden to reserve the right to overthrow its oppression in the spirit of freedom. Freedom is not transacted on a feather bed. How long can you continue to choke off the official bullshit they offer, the problems they create, and then manufacture the solution to its resolve? Are you serious? Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazi regime in Germany, said that if you tell a lie long enough and repeat it enough times, it becomes the truth. Get it? War on terror, over until you're absolutely convinced it's real and there's something we actually have to be on guard for. Lose our civil rights ever more and more, resolve on the war on terror. It's a lie that's been told long enough and enough times that you believe it's absolutely true. The 9/11 Towers incident, inside job, not terrorists. It was your own government that staged that in New York to have 12 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, flood the market with enough oil to keep the price so low that the Middle East is now going bankrupt. And as it does so slowly, the revolutions in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, etc., as well as the other oil-producing nations, they are all imploding because the Middle East is going bankrupt, because the oil to sustain their own economies is really not difficult when you have perspective. It's really not difficult when you have perspective and can objectively focus on who actually stands to gain from the events currently unfolding in our world, and how the shell game is continuing to be played as we continue to move ever closer to the next phase of this drama, which is Iran. As the world financial crisis continues to erode the value of our currency because the unlimited amount of fiat cash that have been printed up since 2008 bubble, we will naturally be heavily reliant upon our military-industrial complex to find short-term solutions for our crumbling nation's woes. Just as we have been doing it for the last 10 years. We will continue to use the influence and flex its power for as long as we can manage to fund it, which in my estimation is not very much longer than the Defense Department and national security apparatus for this country is something like 60% of GDP. Since the annual GDP is projected to shrink by leaps and bounds starting now because of the massive entitlements and soaring medical costs that are insanely out of control, the maintenance to this military-industrial complex will not be available to fund it, and the American military ambitions will undoubtedly have to end, but the military-industrial complex of this country is capable of privately funding its needs for an extended amount of unknown time, even if federal funding is unavailable, because the private interests have every bit as much interest in keeping that military force strong and wield its influence all over the world. It will likely remain functional for some time, but you can be certain that the citizens of our nation will for the most part, be nothing but debt slaves obedient to the government's continued use of scare tactics employed over the people to keep them obedient without posing a threat to their continued rule. The next election for president next year is really nothing more than a joke. I read today that Mitt Romney was collecting huge amounts of money from the Wall Street, already more than Obama, so the implication is that maybe Obama will not get reelected, God willing, we can only hope. But even if Mitt Romney or another candidate finds himself elected and they're pandering to the same elitist fascist banksters that have created the economic meltdown, you will find the very same people continuing the same policies we are currently under. So what's going to actually change in any case? This situation is a dire one for our nation, and we must wake up quickly before it's too late and demand to have the Federal Reserve shut down completely and create our own central bank under Treasury like we should in our Constitution. Remove the greedy banksters that have looted the nation till there's nothing left. Remove the national income tax, the IRS. All these things were created as a result of the Fed and are entirely unnecessary to run the nation. We have a host of other taxes and revenues for our GDP budget. We do not need the national income tax. If we could imagine a real central bank with real gold and silver, like should the debt crisis for our nation could be resolved rather easily in the span of 10 years perhaps. The solutions are out there, but the political will to do it remains to be out of touch.